Hello and welcome everyone, chocolate fans of all flavors, no matter where you are in the world today. Thank you for joining me here today on The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. Today's topic is going to be styles of chocolate, ancient and modern. So we're going to be looking at a little bit of the history of chocolate. We're going to be going back deep into its history. We're going to be looking at lots of differences in the way people have consumed chocolate in the past. People are consuming chocolate in the present. And we'll get to all of those things in just a moment after we come back from this brief introduction. So welcome everybody to today's Chocolate Life Live. And what I want to do today is to take you through some of my thinking about the history of styles of chocolate from ancient to modern. And the influence here, the inspiration for this is actually a Chocolate Life member, a Roman from Russia, who asked me about rustic chocolate, how we might make rustic chocolate. And in thinking about the response to him, and I'm still working on that response, I covered a lot of ground in my mind, and I wanted to share with all of you my thinking on that. If you are watching live, you can go into the chat section or the comments on whatever platform you're watching, whether it's YouTube or LinkedIn. You can, I am recording. Mark, I am recording. So yes, if you ask a question, what I will do is I will get that question into the live stream and try to answer it for you while you're here. But before I actually do go into the topic today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share my screen and let you know this is what's going on the Chocolate Life right now. And this is the homepage, and you can see that we have a link to today's story. It's right here. If you click on that link, you'll go to the post, which is about today's live stream. And if you scroll down, what you'll do is you'll notice that what I've done is I've actually embedded the presentation. So if what you'd like to do is you'd like to download the presentation that I'm going to be presenting, you can watch it during the live stream, or afterwards you can have it to review. I'd also like to say that I have there's reached a milestone. Something that I've wanted to do for quite some time on the Chocolate Life has been to improve the quality of search on the website, and this has been done in the last week. I want to thank my developer, Salaheen, for doing that work for me. If you now go in and you click on the magnifying glass icon, what you'll do is you'll see a list of stories. These are ranked. The search engine indexes all the stories and it ranks them by relevance. Unfortunately, I have no control over that relevance, but if you type in a search word like, let's type in a word like cacao, C-A-C-A-U. This is the Portuguese spelling of the word. One of the things that motivated me to this particular engine was I have the ability to create synonyms for words. So I can type the Portuguese spelling for cacao and get every version of cacao in any language, but also the words cocoa. And so you don't actually have to think about what the spelling is. The search engine will return all of them. And that's really cool because, for example, you might want to type in melange, right? We'll get melange, but the spelling of this in French is going to be with a U, right? And so if you type melanger with a U, you'll be able to get melanger. And we're working on this, and I will be working this in the future. But there's some really, really nice advantage of it. So, for example, if you type in the word porcelana, I've made the association that porcelana is a type of criollo, and you'll find it there. So I'm going to be working on that over the course of the next couple of weeks, working on that index and getting it to work. So just wanted to let everybody know that it's now there. If you have some particular words that you would like to be included, some ideas for things that you think would be great, you can go to the bottom of that post if you're a Chocolate Life member, and you can add that into the post. So, right, with that all done, what I'd like to do is I'd like to formally begin today's presentation about chocolate styles. And I want to begin from my beginning anyway. And let me actually blow this up. Maybe it's a little bigger, but in any event, as I mentioned, this presentation is online. If it's at the post on the Chocolate Life, if you'd like to download it, you can do that. So my OG moment when it came to thinking about chocolate styles came in the early 2000s. So, when I was thinking about developing a rating and reviewing system for my first website, chocophile.com. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to think about a rating and reviewing system categories that were different from just dark or milk or white, right? So, which is one of the ways we think about wine. I think about categories of red wine. I think about categories of white wine. And I wanted to put together a categorization system, which is different as a part of my rating and reviewing system, in part because I don't like using calculators. I mean, so what does the number 93 mean, actually, when you're thinking about a rating and reviewing system? It means 9.3 out of 10, 93 out of 100, but you don't know what went into coming up with that rating system. And so, and I don't like the idea of calculators there. I mean, because in part I have the difference between 87 and 89 is 2 points, but the difference between 89 and 91 is also 2 points. But somehow a 91 is a whole lot better than an 89, even though they're still very, very close apart. There's a psychological value, which is associated with starting with a 9 as opposed to starting with an 8. And so what I ended up doing was creating a categorization system that had 4 categories. Originally 3, and I added a 4th a couple of years later. But the first category was I called Northern European, and we would throw Belgium and Switzerland into this category. And these are typically lighter and sweeter. So when people think primarily about Belgian chocolate, they'll think about filled confection. So they'll think about things for which the center is more important. It might be a ganache, it could be a caramel, there's something else in there. It's more about the shape. So you think of Guillain shells, for example, and the marbling that's on those shells. And it's less about the chocolate than it is about the presentation, and generally quite sweet. The Southern European style of chocolate making was one that I would associate perhaps with France and Italy and Spain. It has a tendency to be darker. It has a tendency to be less sweet, more intense. It was more about the chocolate and less about the fillings. If we can make the distinction, the difference between, for example, a straight espresso and like a cappuccino, a good way to think about the difference in terms of the styles, or the way I thought about it. And then we have the American style of chocolate making. And the American style of chocolate making in the early 2000s was, there was no subtlety whatsoever. If something was mint, it beat you over the head with mint. If something was orange, it beat you over the head with orange or raspberry, whatever it was. It really was never about the chocolate. It was about this delivery of this other flavor, and it's sweet, sweet, sweet. And one of the reasons why Americans tend to like Belgian chocolate is that it matches more closely the sweetness profile that we prefer. It is sweeter. We do tend to like it more. And so that's it. in terms of the basics. And I came across those three in part because I wanted to express this notion of value. And so what I did is I put together a rating system that said, at a given price point for this style of chocolate, right? I would give it a rating of 0 to 7. 0 was basically inedible, to 7, the best example of its kind. And so the idea, again, was focusing on the notion of value rather than saying it was an 83 out of 100 or a 92 out of 100, right? Without understanding what my personal criteria were about how I arrived at those numbers and how I weighted the different factors and the different criteria. This was a very, very straightforward presentation of what I thought you could, where your expectations should get put when you bought a chocolate in this style, what you should have, an idea about where it would be from a flavor perspective, just roughly, but also from a value perspective. I started working for the organizers, the World Pastry Forum and the World Pastry Team Championship in about 2003, 2004. And at that point, I noticed that there was this really interesting movement of primarily French pastry chefs working in America, French chocolatiers working in America. And what they were doing is they were developing a hybrid of what we would think of as the French and American styles. And so it was, the chocolate was more forward, flavors were clear and easily perceptible. When you got done, chocolate was on the back of it. So it was much more chocolate forward. Flavors were subtler. And whether you call it Nouvelle American or Nouvelle French, it represents a hybrid of this Southern European and American style of chocolate making. And I would, from observations, I would say that most of the higher end chocolate that we find in the specialty marketplaces, in fact, will fit into this Nouvelle American, Nouvelle French style of chocolate making. That's what got me interested in the concept of styles and thinking about styles. I was fortunate in about 1996 to be introduced to Michael Coe, who with his wife, Sophia, was the author of the True History of Chocolate. And if we think about chocolate and the styles of chocolate, we can break it down into a number of periods. And so when we think about, chocolate from its beginning, we have to think about chocolate as it was consumed prior to the arrival of Europeans, pre-Hispanic conquest in the Americas. And for the most part, when chocolate was consumed in these times, it was consumed as a beverage. And, none of this should be new to anybody. The idea that, chocolate was consumed as a beverage by the Aztecs, by the Maya, are non-controversial. But there's a reason why I think that this is in fact the case, and that is because there is no refrigeration, right? So what they want to do is they want to be able to have the chocolate, but they can't process the chocolate in advance, keep the processed chocolate in advance in a preserved form. So they're tending to take the beans and roast them and grind them and then add. They don't have sugar at this point. So cane sugar originated in India. It was one of the reasons why the Europeans were looking at expanding into the New World, was to find a place to grow sugar that they controlled in their colonies. And while there may have been small amounts of honey, certainly the Melipona bee is known for making honey, but it's not as prolific as the European honeybee is. So they might have had small amounts of honey. It wasn't a primary ingredient in the chocolate that they were consuming, the beverage they were consuming. They would have been adding chili peppers. They would have been adding other spices. Ear flour is one. Perhaps it was either cacao, might have been another very, very traditional spice. And it would have probably been drunk at room temperature. But the primary driver behind this is the fact that if you left a bit of chocolate out, right, at ambient temperature, which is often going to be above the melting point of cocoa butter, it's just going to get messy on you, right? And that has some pretty interesting implications as we move forward. This whole idea of refrigeration it turns out to be very, very important. From the conquest, so from the time the Europeans arrived in the Americas until 1847. I chose 1847 for a very, very specific reason. 1847 is the year in which the Fry family in England were the first people who are recorded to have added cocoa butter to chocolate. So they would have taken cocoa butter, which would have been expressed from cocoa liquor. That's a technology that was patented in the 18 teens by members of the Van Houten family. And they would have said, we've got all this cocoa butter, what are we going to do with it? And they're going to add it back into the chocolate. So prior to 1847, we had what we would call today two-ingredient chocolate, primarily cocoa beans and sugar ground together. There might have been some flavorings added, at this point, vanilla and other things might have been grown in, but we basically have this what we would think today as a two-ingredient chocolate. It might not have been as highly refined as we see it today, right? But still, people were taking advantage of the machinery which was developed in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. So we're finding ways to move from coarse grinders that also would have been used to grind grains, so in the Americas, corn and wheat and other grains, for flours for baking. They would have also used those stone grinding mills to be able to refine cocoa beans into paste. From there, what we do is we find that as the Industrial Revolution goes along, so between as we go from 1847 into the 1880s, what we do is we find moving more and more from metal or from stone into metal grinding surfaces. And what we also do is we see that adding like steam power, just more pressure, right, which is going to be able to take the particle size of the chocolate that's being made and make those particles smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And so this is the trend that we're seeing over the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. After 1880 until today, most of the innovation that has come along has been in how do we create more faster, right? It's not necessarily that entirely new techniques of chocolate making have been developed. We're starting to see some of that now as we're looking at a better understanding of the genome, better understanding of molecular biology, and other techniques are starting to bring in some new techniques for chocolate making. But in general, by the time we get to the end of the 1880s, that most of the dominant styles in chocolate have been developed, and right. And what we're seeing is a transition from primarily a rustic form of chocolate, so something which is grainy, right? Because we can't get the particle sizes down really, really small, to something which is much smoother. And so as we move forward through this, I can think of the 1870s as perhaps arguably as the most important decade in the history of modern chocolate. So what we do is we see the introduction of milk chocolate. So Henri Nestle and Daniel Peter get together, and they are the first people to be able to make a milk chocolate. And the primary reason for developing a milk chocolate is actually to be able to reduce the cost of chocolate. If I can replace the expensive ingredient, cocoa beans, with low-cost sugar and low-cost milk, then what I can do is I can produce a product which I can sell for less money. And although it's not until the 1890s that Milton Hershey joins this trend in the United States. I mean, Milton Hershey's genius is not that he made great chocolate. It's that he made chocolate affordable. I mean, he understood that that chocolate at that point was an exotic flavor, and by being able to drive down the price and be able to make it affordable to people, that it would grow much, much faster than the current business he was in, which was making caramels. And so, quite interesting in that respect. Other things that happen in the 1870s besides the invention of milk chocolate or at least the industrialized production of milk chocolate. We find that milk had been added to chocolate as a beverage in the 1600s in England, but this move away from drinking chocolate primarily to eating chocolate primarily begins to happen in the late 1800s. Another thing that happened in the 1870s was the invention or the discovery of the conch by Rudolf Lindt. So for the first time, what we do is we have a mechanical means of being able to remove any excess acidity that might have been in the chocolate. So alkalization, which was invented in the early 1800s, was a chemical method of reducing the acidity, but the chemical was indiscriminate. It did not make a choice about which chemicals it was going to get rid of. So not only did it get rid of the acidity, so we take acid, we neutralize it with a base, an alkali, so we're reducing the acidity. But what it's also doing is it's changing the chemical structure. It's making it perhaps a little easier for it to mix in. It is also changing the color. So by changing the kind of alkali, its concentration, the contact time, when and how it's introduced into the chocolate making process, then what we can do is we can change the color of the chocolate as well. And if the pH is one level, we might get something which is red. And if the pH is another level, we could get something which is black. And that's where the black cocoa, which is used to make Oreos, come from. It's just very, very heavily alkalized. It has a pH which is 9, 10, very, 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 very high. But the conch is very, very important because what it does is it provides a mechanical means to do things like drive off volatile aromatic compounds, such as acetic acid, but other acids and flavors that may not be wanted in the chocolate. And by changing the amount of time and by changing the temperature, I can be very, very selective about how I drive those aromatic chemicals off. So I can carefully get to just getting rid of the acidity, and then so I don't smell it anymore, the vinegar which is left over from fermentation, and I can drop the temperature and change the speed and just start working on the texture. And conching, in addition to playing with flavor, also plays with texture. What you're doing is you're breaking up particle agglomerates, so that if there are big clumps of particles, you break them down into individual particles. And then more importantly, or just as importantly, what you're doing is you're covering those clumps of particles with fat, right? So that you can't feel them on your tongue. Now, one of the other things that's happening when we cover up all the sugar particles with fat is we're changing the rate at which that sugar comes in contact with our tongue. So what we have to do is we have to melt through the cocoa butter with our saliva, right, and other things, dissolve the fat, and then get to the sugar particle, right? When we look back at chocolate, which is pre-Hispanic conquest, they didn't use sugar, but as we moved into the early use of chocolate and manufacturing of chocolate in Europe, one of the styles which comes up is called Modican. And modern brands that you might associate with this style of chocolate include Doña Elvira and Antica Dolceria Bonaiuto. It is characterized by very, very coarse grains of cocoa. So we're not very, very highly refining the cocoa beans. And then also very, very large chunks or crystals of sugar. And you can think of it as using the sugar as an inclusion. So we're taking the ground up cocoa beans and we're throwing the sugar in and we're just mixing it in. We're not actually doing any additional refining. And that's important because what's left over actually is fairly stable at room temperature. So if you've got if you've got an environment where you don't have refrigeration and the temperatures above the melting point of cocoa butter with a lot of sugar mixed into the product, you've got something which is not going to melt as easily. And so when we think, for example, of modern Mexican drinking chocolate, whether it's Abuelita or any other brand, that's what we see. We see a coarse chocolate we see with big sugar crystals. And one of the reasons why that's okay is that that chocolate is actually not meant to be eaten. It's meant to be broken up into chunks and then dissolved into hot water or hot milk. So the fact that the sugar is not completely refined into the chocolate doesn't matter, right? Because we're not going to eat it. Whereas Modican chocolate or Modica style chocolate is made to be eaten. It is an interesting style of chocolate. It is I would say, an acquired taste. I mean, you either do like the texture or you don't like the texture. Um, it's something that I enjoy on an irregular basis, just tucking into some and going, wow, I love the variety of styles that get made. But um, and if you want to, you can also go in and you can go and take a chunk of this chocolate and throw it into hot water, hot milk, dissolve it, and and turn it into a beverage. Equally possible thing to do. Um, so this is some of what it is that conching addresses. Is that we have taken the ability to move from stone grinders to metal grinders, so roll mills and things like that, and to be able to take increased pressure, right? So one of the challenges with a stone grinder, right, is if you increase the pressure past a certain point, you start grinding the stone into the chocolate, which is not a great thing. It can affect the taste, certainly can affect the texture. And I made this offhand remark on another in other situations about if you are making chocolate and you're using a melanger, you're using a wet grinder, then one of the things you may wish to do is actually lick the stones when they're clean. So clean them, lick, let them dry, and then lick the stones. Because what you may find is you recognize that taste in your chocolate or someone else's chocolate. And so you can say, oh, this is a chocolate that I know is made in a wet grinder because there's this specific taste of the stone that I can recognize. It sounds crazy, but it was a very useful discovery for me to be able to do that. And Laura, who's joining us from Facebook today, says changing the micron size is very important. Right, love smooth chocolate, but as you say, Mexican style is very, very different. And I think, yes, Marion, absolutely, I agree with you there. But I think that it's important to really point out that one style is not inherently better than another. They're very, very different. And one of the things I love about chocolate is that there are a lot of different styles, and that what I can do is I can embrace a lot of different styles and enjoy them for what they are, rather than trying to say, well, is this style of chocolate better than this style of chocolate? Maybe if I'm in a particular mood, or maybe if I want to achieve a particular result, one style of chocolate might be better than another. But there's nothing inherent in that. I mean, it's not an objective kind of determination. It's very, very subjective, right? For example, if I grew up in a culture, right? So I grew up in Oaxaca, and I walk down the street and I can go to Mayordomo, and my family's recipe is on file at Mayordomo. I can walk in and, everybody knows me, and I can, get a couple of kilos, and, they will know exactly how much cocoa with how much sugar and how much perhaps almonds and how much cinnamon to add to my recipe, and I'm going to take it home. If I grew up in that culture, you're going to have trouble convincing me that a different style of chocolate is necessarily going to be a better style of chocolate. But I think that one of the things that I have sort of hinted at, but I think is a very important tipping point when it comes to the history of chocolate, especially modern chocolate, is that 1870s saw the introduction of ammonia-based commercial refrigeration. So up until this point, if I wanted to cool something down, my only option was either take it to a very high elevation, right, or use ice, right, and that's an industry all in in and of itself. I have an insulated box, and at the top of that insulated box, I put a block of ice. And every day or a couple of times a week, somebody comes by and I put a new block of ice in the top of my ice box. That's why they're called ice boxes. But what we find in the 1870s is the introduction of commercial refrigeration, ammonia-based refrigeration. And now what we have is the ability to maintain a specific temperature. I can keep that temperature consistently over very, very long periods of time. And so now what I can do is I can take this much more highly refined European style chocolate and um, again, this more highly refined European style chocolate, and I don't have to worry about it melting, right? And at this point, we find that right, the last bit of the technological puzzle required to usher in the modern the modern chocolate movement came into being. And so while we'll find some innovation, so for example, the introduction of white chocolate in the late 1930s. I mean, that's not actually really a technical innovation. It's just we have a lot of cocoa butter. How do we get rid of the cocoa butter? Right. That was literally the motivation for the introduction of white chocolate. But as I say, but once we have um, refining with metal technologies in place, we have conching technologies in place, and we have refrigeration technologies in place. This is the foundation for the modern chocolate world, and the two of these things happened. The conch and the refrigeration happened in the 1870s, which is one of the reasons why I think it is perhaps the most important decade in the history of chocolate. If you believe differently, so for example, you might be Belgian in background, and you might think that the alkalization and the invention, or at least the patenting of the first hydraulic cocoa butter presses, which happened in the 18 teens or thereabouts, were more important. Hey, please send me a comment. Let me know. We can discuss that. It's very, very much a subjective determination. We're about halfway through the hour. I want to spend a few seconds resetting the room and letting everybody know that they're watching The Chocolate Life Live. I come to you every Tuesday and Friday on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And we talk about topics in cocoa and chocolate. On Tuesdays, I tend to focus about people and personalities, and Friday, I tend to focus on broad topics. If what it is you'd like to do is you'd like to go and to The Chocolate Life right now, what you can do is here's the current homepage. Here we have the post for today's live stream. I have a calendar of all upcoming live streams and then an archive of all previous live streams. So you can go set your schedule accordingly. If you are a member of The Chocolate Life, and if you're watching this, I hope you will not only like and subscribe to these video live streams on whatever platform that you're watching on. YouTube, certainly subscribe and like and comment there. Great. Really, really appreciated. On LinkedIn, absolutely the same. But you can join The Chocolate Life. So I'm logged into my account. We see this little green button here. It says account in the upper right-hand corner. It may be a little difficult for you to see, but if you're not a member, it will say join. You can click on that link, join. There's a free membership level, but there's also levels in which you can financially support what it is that I'm doing here. And I don't accept ads. I don't take ads. And, so, your direct support of what it is that I'm doing is really, really important to me. It helps keep my spirits up. And at this particular, I also want to point out to Mark at Blue Spruce Chocolate for upgrading his level of support to me in the last week. It's very, very, very much appreciated. But let's get back to the presentation, right? Where we're talking about styles of chocolate from ancient to modern. We have a question coming in from Aze. Hopefully I pronounced that properly, who asks, do we know something about the way that cacao was processed by the Maya and by other pre-Columbian civilizations? Was it unfermented lavado? And when did fermentation play a role? Lavado means washed. And if you do not wash the cocoa, or So if you're not careful about how you dry the cocoa, let's put it that way, it will very, very quickly start to mold and mildew. And so if you're going to preserve cocoa, one of the ways to do it is to remove it from the pod and immediately put it out in the sun to dry. And when you do that, you get the pulp, and the pulp sticks to the outside of the seeds. And this is what in the Dominican Republic we would call Sanchez, all right, cocoa. It's named for a port, but the style of cocoa is just unfermented, but just put out in the sun to dry. Lavado refers to washing the pulp off of the beans before putting them out to dry. And as near as we know, right, through to Aztec times, so roughly through the time that the Europeans invaded the Americas, that this was how cocoa was processed, right? So that the cocoa, the seeds would have been pulled from the shells, the pulp would have been washed off the shells, and then they would have been put out to dry. They're polished, they look nicer. And one ways we can think about this is that, or one ways we can corroborate this is that the report by Columbus on his third voyage, when he was first introduced to cocoa, when his ship ran across a Mayan trading canoe off the island of Guanaja, is the discussion. They talk about almonds, or that's the word the Europeans used to describe them. And so there's the sense in which my impression is, right, the way I read it, is that these would have been washed. I mean, they would have been clean, and they would have looked like an almond with its skin on, right? And so that points to lavado, at least the cocoa beans being washed in that part of the world through at least the early 1500s. So, but it's unclear to me. I have not been able to pinpoint a particular date at which it became important to start fermenting for flavor development. Certainly, we all know that fermenting grapes, turns them into wine. It creates alcohol, but we're adding flavor and we're changing complexity. It's something that was knowledge that was understood sort of spontaneously. I mean, if I am in the rainforest, right, and I'm scratching for calories, I need to find calories wherever it is that I am. There are only a couple of things I can do to preserve food, right? So I can smoke it, I can otherwise dry it, I can roast it, right? I can salt it. So those are about the things that I can do, and I have to do them in a certain order. If I'm going to smoke something, I can do it wet, but if I'm going to roast it, chances are it needs to be dry before I start roasting. So we tend to forget that the people who are living in these areas at these times were incredibly sophisticated in terms of their understanding of breeding. They were very, very careful watchers of the sky. So the fact that it would be surprising if they were unaware of what fermentation did to cocoa. It changed the flavor, right? However, the calculation would have been needed to be made about whether the amount of labor involved in fermentation, right, was worth, in the end, worth whatever the outcome is. So, was it worthwhile spending 3 to 5 to 7 days fermenting the cocoa before drying it? Was that labor worthwhile? And it again, I believe that calculation, and understanding when that happens, is probably key to understanding when fermentation became very, very important to cocoa. I mean, in some cultures, lavado cocoa, right, a significant percentage of the cocoa that comes out of the states of Tabasco and Chiapas in Mexico these days are still lavado. In part, it's cultural. This is the cocoa they grew up with. This is the flavor that they like. I mean, they like things which tend to be heavily roasted, for which the flavors of straight chocolate, coffee, and nuts, right, is predominant, right? And even though we could say that criollos might have been bred in what we think of as modern day um, Guatemala, Belize, Yucatan, right, into Chiapas and Tabasco, even though that may be where the Olmecs and the Toltecs were driven to domesticate and breed Criollo. That's one of the theories. It's not clear that um, it's not clear that fermentation was a part of what they were doing. Is if I could take a white bean, which I knew to be less bitter than a dark bean, that what I would have done is I would have been selecting for varieties that delivered me less, more white beans, so that when I did make the cocoa, it would have been less bitter. And that might have been the driver for the domestication and the breeding of white varieties over darker varieties. But fermentation on a wide scale was something that came about, to my understanding, when Europeans started taking over the large scale commercial cultivation of cocoa. Right? So I hope that answers. I hope that answers the question. It is a great. It is a great question, and there are parts of the world today for where again still. Especially for domestic consumption. So, for example, or domestic consumption. For example, in Nicaragua, their term for lavado is cacao rojo, red cocoa, and a lot of the exports of cacao rojo from Nicaragua are to Honduras and El Salvador. So they're regional exports, and it is unfermented and it is washed, right? Um, so. So absolutely. So before modern refrigeration in the 1870s, when cooling could finally be controlled, wasn't there difficulty controlling heat temperature, adding to the challenge of refining? So, Keith, um, um, temperature control in general, absolutely. But what I would point out is if I'm doing low speed milling, right? So if my grinding stones are turning in terms of tens per minute, right, revolutions, then the heat buildup is not going to be as great as if I'm running something at hundreds of thousands of revolutions per minute. And so I don't necessarily know that controlling the heat in the refining process was quite the challenge that we find it today when what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a ton of product through an hour as opposed to a ton of product a month. Now, I would have, so if I am in Mexico, and Roberto, thank you for this, Mexican culture began to consume chocolate with the not fermented beans. Absolutely. Right. So that would be lavado. And again, I think that may have been a decision related to the cost of processing. Was it worth the time that it took to ferment the beans before drying them? And it made sense to wash the pulp off for one reason or another. But what I wanted to say is that, so for example, if I'm in Mexico, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the beans, I'm going to roast them on a comal, right? And then I'm going to take them on the comal and I'm going to put them on a grindstone, a metate. And because the beans have a high percentage of fat, roughly 50%, it does make sense to warm up the metate, right? So just to make it easier to get the fat liquid and to run things through. And that would have been done by putting the metate over some sort of fire, whether fire with flames or coals. And so I did want it warm because the natural motion of grinding with the mano on top of the metate might not have generated enough heat to make the process efficient. But again, when it came to controlling the temperature with larger scale refining, it becomes an issue with when the grinding speeds become very, very high. Now, one way we do this today, so I can get a 3-roll mill, which is a high-speed 3-roll mill, in which case the rolls are revolving, hundreds, if not thousands of RPM. What I do is I recirculate, I run cold water through them, right? And refrigeration is necessary if what I want to do is I want to recirculate that water. So I put the water through, it gets heated up, it controls the temperature of the grinding surfaces. And then what I'll do is I'll recirculate it into something that cools it down, and then I'll recirculate it again through that. So I have a closed loop process. If, however, I take groundwater, which might be at 56 to 60 degrees, somewhere in there, and I use it once, right? I just push it through and let it drain on the other end, then I can use cold water, right, in order to be able to regulate the temperatures of things. And we do this today. There are tempering machines which use cold water to be able to control the temperature. If I have a universal, right, that universal will have a water jacket around it, and I circulate chilled water through it. And I know people who live in places where they might be on a well, and so their water is free, or they have access to low-cost municipal water, and they'll just use the water once and let it go into the drain when they get done. So yeah, no, absolutely. It's a different kind of issue. But there are ways to control temperature. I've been involved in putting recirculating chillers. So you can use an aquarium chiller and a pump to recirculate the water through a high-speed 3-roll mill. Although in general, I tend to prefer, if I'm going to do a 3-roll mill, I tend to prefer, especially if I'm working with cocoa, using a granite mill, which because it's a slow speed mill, it doesn't generate the temperatures that we have to worry about. We have to worry about cooling. Before we go on, another question from Mark at Blue Source: is a grindometer in your toolbox? The answer is absolutely yes. If you are making chocolate, and one of the things that you want to know is you want to know what the particle size distribution of your chocolate is. Right? So in general, most people think that what you want to do is you want to get the center of the distribution, right, somewhere in the 15 to 20 micron range. You want to have a fairly narrow peak, right? And then what you want to do is you want to make sure that you don't have too many small particles and too many big particles. If you have too many big particles, then what you'll do is you'll feel those particles on your tongue. Not a bad, which depending on what you're doing, it might not be a bad thing. I mean, I have a bar of chocolate that I was tasting with Max Gandy on Tuesday session, Quetzali from Walter Chocolates in Tabasco. This is their Mexican Memoria Mexicanas bar. It has pimienta gorda, which is a type of allspice, and the allspice is not ground in, although they have salt, which is ground into the chocolate. The allspice is cracked, and then so I have the texture of allspice in the chocolate. So I'm using the pimienta gorda as an inclusion. Grindometers or a grind gauge is a precision machined device made of metal in which there is 1 or 2 ramps, right? And what you can do is you can use a spreader to spread the chocolate down this ramp, and it will tell you, number one, if you've got big particles that need filtering out, and what the minimum and maximum particle size is in whatever it is that you're making. So a grindometer, in my opinion, even though it is more expensive than a micrometer, is a much better tool. Micrometer, number one, is you need to take the chocolate, you need to dilute the chocolate with the fat before you can measure the particle size. And then you have to be careful about how much pressure you apply to the grindometer, because if you apply pressure to a big particle, it'll just crush the big particle. Right? So I recommend the use of the grindometer. Grindometers are also used in everything from the production of paint to the production of the slips that are used to cover porcelain to peanut butter, right? To be able to do quality control and measure and make sure that the particles that we're grinding in the chocolate in the peanut butter are not too small. And that's really, really important. If you have a lot of particles that are too small, it will change the texture of the chocolate. It will not melt properly. It'll give you sort of this like peanut buttery, kind of texture to your chocolate, which you probably want to avoid. So a grindometer is a really, really good piece of equipment. I recommend them. And like many things, you don't get what you don't pay for. And so I would recommend not going for the cheapest version you can find on Amazon, that it makes sense to buy one from a manufacturer that is doing precision gauges for something like paint production. right? Because you'll get something which is much more precisely machined and is going to do better. It may cost 2 or 3 times as much, but when you amortize that over all of the chocolate that you made over the course of years, I think it's an investment that's well worth making. Okay, from that, we've gone to the timeline of styles, 1880 to today. As I say, in terms of styles of chocolate, there's not been a whole lot of new styles of chocolate that have been invented. We have new types of chocolate, new categories of chocolate. So, as I say, white chocolate would have been invented in the 1930s. Ruby chocolate, irrespective of what you think about it, it's an interesting question. Why does chocolate have to be brown, right? Why are we focused on oxidation colors and roasting colors? Is there a way of preserving the color of a fresh cocoa bean? I think that's a really interesting um, bit of innovation. Laura asked the question, and I was just going to go there, but Laura, thank you very much for asking that question. What about whole fruit? So there are a number of companies that are looking at how do I create a chocolate where 100% of the ingredients in the chocolate come from the cocoa seed. So we already know that the cocoa mass and the cocoa butter come from the cocoa seed, but can I create a sweetener that comes from the pulp? And so whole fruit is Barry Callebaut's branding for this. Felklin makes one. Nestle makes one. I only think that it's used to cover some Kit Kats in Japan. Excuse me. But they are making chocolate, and I believe Ritter has done one. Ritter lost a lawsuit with the German government. The German government said you couldn't legally call it chocolate if the sweetener was made from cacao pulp. I don't understand that. I don't necessarily agree with that determination. But is it another style of chocolate? So, Laura, I would say no, it's not another style of chocolate. All that we're doing is we're placing one particular kind of sugar with another particular kind of sugar. So is unsweetened chocolate a different style of chocolate from a chocolate which is 70% cocoa beans and 30% sugar? I don't think that they're a different style of chocolate. Is a chocolate that is sweetened with stevia or sweetened with maltitol, is it a different style of chocolate? I don't think so, because most of the time people are talking about this as a dark chocolate or a milk chocolate or a white chocolate. All we're doing is we're focused on what the sweetener is. And I think that whole fruit, I would categorize it the same way. If there is a different style to whole fruit, it's actually something that I would point out is a stylistic problem that I would approach Ruby about as well, which is that when I have a whole fruit chocolate, and in the United States, it may be available from the Callebaut brand Cocoa Berry, and it is branded Evo Cow, right? There is on the box or on the bag, there's this warning. It says, warning, be careful about how you process this. Do not get this chocolate above 40 degrees centigrade, right? And most people know that, listen, if I want to melt out the crystals in chocolate, I've got to get it to at least 45, right? And for some reason, there's something about the particular physical and chemical characteristics of the sugar that is used in Evo Cow, which means you shouldn't get it above 40 degrees centigrade. Otherwise, it won't retemper properly. The rheology changes, which affects fluidity, viscosity. So you have to be really, really careful about how you use it. I don't think that's a different style. It's just a technical quirk that is probably going to be a pain in the butt. You really need to be committed to want to use this particular chocolate. And if you have a whole production line which is based around chocolate at much higher temperature and a particular fluidity, changing all of the characteristics of your tempering machines and everything on your line to be able to accommodate a chocolate which can't get to that temperature, it's going to be a technical challenge. It's not going to be something you're going to do probably in an afternoon. It's going to take a while in order to be able to figure out. And then I sort of wonder is like, okay, what is, these Eva Cow, they're available in callets or pistols, whatever it is. Pistols is a trademark term. I forget who owns it. as are Calabo pellets. I mean, um, but I wonder what happens when you bake with it. I mean, if I'm not supposed to get about 40 degrees centigrade, what do I do if I melt it down and put it into a molten lava cake? What does that do? Is that something I even want to try? And so I think that it's limited in terms of its application in many ways. Another thing which I find pretty consistent about the chocolates, which are sweetened with cocoa pulp, um, is that they tend to taste a lot like a fermentation pile. I mean, Felklin made one. They used the cocoa juice that Coa Pure from Switzerland has been producing there, and they made a chocolate. And it is probably the only inedible chocolate I've ever got from Felklin. I mean, it is so acidic. It is so sour. It is so reminiscent of a fermentation pile that I struggle to think, okay, what are the things that number one, I don't like to eat it. I mean, it's like just too aggressively acidic. I don't like it. Just eating it on its own. The texture is very, very hard and crunchy. It doesn't melt the way I would expect a chocolate, although it melts the way a lot of two ingredient chocolates melt, right? So if you have a low cocoa butter content and it's mostly sugar and it's nibs, I mean, there's a crunchiness to it. And so there's some similarity there to think about. Um, but it's the flavor for the most part. The Felklin product has the problem, and the Eva Cow. I mean, I put it in my mouth. I open up the box, and it's like it's like my eyes start to water with the acidity of it. They did some experiments with some panning, and I find that once the chocolate is gone, the panned item is fine. But when the chocolate and the panned item are in my mouth at the same time, it's just like the balance between the two is way wrong. And so I think you need to be very, very careful about what you pair these chocolates with. I would want an acidic fruit. I would want passion fruit. I would want raspberries. I want something that's really quite acidic. Might also be quite sweet as well, which is the yin yang of chocolate. It is acidic, but it is sweet at the same time. The cocoa beans are, right? The pulp is sweet and acidic at the same time. I'd want to see how I would balance that in terms of everything else that I am pairing it with. I mean, and I mentioned ruby. I mean, ruby is not stable. It's not bake stable. The color, right? There's no ruby chocolate chips, right, that I can put into chocolate chip cookies. And one of the reasons why is that when you get it above a certain temperature, it starts to turn gray. Or if it sits on the shelf too long, it starts to change color. It's no longer the purple that it is. And so I think they're interesting innovations. I think they have some interesting applications. When I was in Tokyo in 2020, just before pandemic lockdown, I was at the launch of Ruby for Valentine's Day in 2020, and the range of applications that I saw for that particular product were just really, really, really quite remarkable. But is it a different style of chocolate? Not in the same sense that I'm thinking about these other styles of chocolate, which are based on other physical properties. But now that you mentioned them, I may go and slightly change my thinking when I do this presentation again. I want to point out this is the last slide in the formal presentation. We have about 5 or 10 minutes left. If people have more questions about this topic, please go about doing this. Again, if you haven't had an opportunity to like this video, please do so. Subscribe to the Chocolate Wire channel on YouTube if that's where you happen to be watching. If you're not already a member of the Chocolate Life, please join the Chocolate Life. There is always a free tier, but if you want to support what it is that I'm doing here, the subscriptions on the Chocolate Life are the only way that I earn money for doing what it is that I'm doing. And it's the way that you can support these. When you become a member, you can comment on any one of the videos, and there is a monthly members only AMA that you can get invited to, and then you can suggest topics and guests for future Chocolate Life live streams. So heading into the home stretch here on the Chocolate Life Live, I want to reiterate a point that I made earlier, which is I do not think that two ingredient chocolate is a new style of chocolate. I don't think it is revolutionary. I don't think that two ingredient chocolate is the future. I think it is a part of a future, but I do not know that it is the future. And the reason why is that most of the chocolate that is manufactured and consumed in the world has at least in 3 ingredients, if not 5, right? And not everybody wants to eat chocolate all the time, which requires paying very, very careful attention to the chocolate. Right. So yeah, if I've got a 2 ingredient chocolate, I'm going to put it in my mouth and I'm going to pay attention to it. I'm going to deconstruct it. That's fine. Right. But I don't want to do that all the time. The same thing is true of wine. There are times when I drink wine where what I want to do is pay attention to it and think about how it pairs with what it is that I'm eating and other things like that. And there are times when I just want to drink about it and I want something which is pleasant, right? And in my experience, most 2 ingredient chocolates don't fit into that latter category. In order to be able to truly appreciate them, you have to pay attention to them. And sometimes they reward the attention that you pay, and sometimes they don't reward the attention that you pay. But that is a conundrum. In fact, 2 ingredient chocolate is a retro movement. It is going back to a style of chocolate making which existed prior to the Industrial Revolution, and is in fact pre-1847 in its origins. That's what 2 ingredient chocolate is. It is a style of chocolate on its own, right? But it represents something which is historical, not necessarily something which is future and modern, right? It's retro. In my opinion, you can disagree with me. If you've got a question you'd like to comment you'd like to make about that, please let me know. Happy to get it into the discussion. What I do want to talk about is something that I added to my lexicon um, over a decade ago. And that's a style of chocolate making that I call Pan-American. And what it is the meeting in the middle between the traditional rustic style of chocolate making that we would find either in Modican chocolate or in Mexican style hot chocolate, whether it's modern abuelito or it goes down to mayordomo. And it's the one that was pioneered here in the United States by Taza. And so what we do is we find a chocolate in which the sugar is partially refined. So we do have a texture that's associated with the chocolate, the cocoa beans. They're not perfectly finely refined, and we do have a texture which is associated with the sugar. Now, it is these particles are not huge, but they're there to provide some texture into the chocolate. And I think that it deserves recognition as a style on its own, fitting somewhere between the smooth, luxurious, very high cocoa butter content, mouthfeel melt, which we associated with traditional European chocolates, whether they're Swiss or Belgian or French. I mean, my introduction to getting into chocolate was that from Bonin in France, and so I am a huge fan. And a lot of that is sentimental and emotional. I know I love this chocolate because that was my introduction to this world of chocolate. And I have these really, really strong attachments and associations to it as well, right? And but it is a valid style of chocolate making. At the other end, we have something which is coarse. I think the farthest we'd go in terms of modern production would be Modican's style, something which is very, very coarse and deliberately so, right? And then you have this thing which is in between, which I call Pan-American. It was developed here in the United States. It is a mixture of styles of chocolate which are manufactured here in the Americas, both modern, more European style chocolate making and ancient, more traditional styles of chocolate making. And so that's why I call it Pan-American, because of this unique merger. And I think that the future of chocolate is a really interesting one. And before I get there, right, I was anticipating, not remembering what my slide order was. I want to put a shout out to Max Gandy, Dame Cacao, who was my guest on Tuesday, who at the very end asked me about Filipino style of chocolate. It was called Chocolate and Chocolate A. And I had to admit that I never heard of it before. And so she was very, very nice to send me a link to a page where they discussed. So if you go to the presentation, The link to this page is embedded in the presentation on this page. So, please, if you're having trouble reading it and you want to know more about it, it's pretty fascinating. Just how culturally the language gets used and how language creeps into things. And that's going to be part of our discussion for next Friday, language about words, beliefs, actions, and consequences. But the difference between chocolate and chocolate is that one of them is likened to being full-bodied, like an espresso, right? And if you are served the chocolate one, I believe it's the chocolate it means that your host holds you in high regard, that they're going to give you the good stuff, the full stuff, the high test, right? Whereas that they give you the chocolate it means that what they're doing is they're giving you the watered down version of what's going on. So yeah, so just this notion of, it's the other way around. Yeah, chocolate means espresso, thick, and then means aguado, which means watered down. And I just think, that's just a fabulous way that language, becomes embedded into the fabric of the way that we think about chocolate. It's just really, really great. I mean, it's just a fun little story, and I want to thank Max for sharing that with me. Not just the idea, but sending me the link and giving me some time to think about this over the course of a while. I want to close the hour by sort of bridging to next Friday's topic and coming back here. Is that for a long time, the industry has been struggling with, what do we really mean by bean to bar? What do we really mean by craft? What do we really mean by artisan? What do we mean by fine even? I mean, this is a real challenge. And we're 25 years in, Scharfenberger opened in 1996, 1997, and we're still having what appear to be sort of foundational linguistic debates. And I think number one is that's the wrong place to be having this whole debate at the moment. We're still having these debates after 25 years. It's no wonder that the industry is not growing as quickly as it could be if we are the people who are in the industry can't agree among ourselves about basic definitions. And so, the beer world is that a problem? What does a craft brewer mean? And I don't think anybody is really happy with the definition that has been decided upon. But nonetheless, it's one that everybody agrees to and they use it. And I think that this widespread adoption is important. And again, sort of prefacing next Friday's talk on language, I want to introduce this notion of specialty chocolate. It's the one that I use, right? It's not necessarily a type of chocolate. It's not necessarily a category of chocolate. It's a way of thinking about chocolate. And it's a way that parallels an accepted usage in the world of coffee. So in coffee, a specialty coffee is made with a specialty coffee bean. And a specialty coffee bean is any bean that has been assigned a rating by professional graders, Q graders, and they've all agreed that this is a bean that will produce a great cup of coffee. And they're less interested in what the origin is. They're less interested in what the actual genetics are, although both of those things play into it. Post-harvest processing, there is fermentation involved in many kinds of coffee, wet and dry, right? So all of these things play into it, but in the end, the question is, will this coffee bean make a fine cup of coffee, right? And if so, we call it a specialty coffee bean, and then any coffee made from that is a specialty coffee. And what I want to suggest is that we can use the same approach when it comes to chocolate, right? Number one is that we already have a huge group of people that understands the word specialty and how it gets used with respect to coffee. But we can say, okay, let us focus on rating the beans, right? And in coffee, you do this by taking the beans and roasting them and then cupping them. And so in this respect, I think that the Cocoa of Excellence has got it right. You take the beans, you convert them into liquor and chocolate, and then what you do is you evaluate the liquor and chocolate. You don't evaluate the beans, right, on their own, because very few people just eat straight cocoa beans or eat straight cocoa nibs. I mean, they are used sometimes, but if the goal is to be able to evaluate the chocolate, then you need to transform the beans into liquor and chocolate to do the evaluation. But if we were to take that idea, here are all of the winners in the Cocoa of Excellence, or the finalists in the Cocoa of Excellence. We can give them grading scores, and we could say that any chocolate made from any of these beans is a specialty chocolate. And I think that transcends, it doesn't make a value judgment about fine, right? It doesn't make a value judgment about origin. It doesn't make a value judgment about genetics. It doesn't make judgments about anything. It's just, does this bean make a good tasting product? And what I'd like to suggest, closing out the Chocolate Life today, or the Chocolate Life Live today, this discussion of history of styles, ancient to modern, is that we start thinking about beans and chocolate around this use of the word specialty, and to move forward, and that there is value in doing so. And then we have it accommodates any kind of style of chocolate, right? No matter how the chocolate is manufactured, we have this new definition for what specialty means. And I think that there's going to be an enormous amount of value in doing so. Before we close, I want to say thank you to all of you who've been here. I want to say thank you to all of you who are going to watch this afterwards. I hope that many of you will download the presentation. It's on the website right now. It's on TheChocolateLife.com on the post for the live stream for today's post, and that you will take a few moments to like and to subscribe going forward. And then before we close out, I want to say hello to Juliana from Brazil. I follow you, I believe, on Instagram, Juliana. Thank you for being a part of today's presentation. I'm glad you found what it is that I had to say informative, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to coming back to Brazil soon. I'm hoping to arrange that to happen. I hope to be at Chocolate Bahia in June or July. And then closing out this hour, what I want to do is I want to say that this coming Tuesday, my guest will be Nick Davis of 11 Cacao in Jamaica. And then a week from today, we're going to be looking at language. So how words and phrases inform our beliefs, how beliefs inform our actions, how actions have consequences. And the basis for that session has to do with whether or not the use of the term blacklist and whitelist, which is an initiative that I started a couple of weeks ago. Are those words so loaded in terms of their meaning that they get in the way of understanding? And can I make the point that I want to make using different language? And so we're going to be discussing that with some special guests next Friday. Hope you can make it then. And one final comment from Martha from Mexico. Martha, hi, welcome back. Hola, and look forward to seeing you. I'm hoping to be in Villahermosa for the Festival del Chocolate in November. And with that, everybody, have a great weekend. Hope to find you back here next Tuesday on the Chocolate Life Live.